It's time to cut the useless people out of our lives, starting with her, and my father said as he raised his champagne glass during our New Year's Eve toast, then pointed directly at me in front of more than 30 relatives gathered around the dining room, and for a moment the entire house seemed to freeze between laughter and silence. A few people chuckled awkwardly, several others stared into their drinks as if they suddenly found the bubbles fascinating, and nobody said a word in my defense. Not my brother, not my mother, not the cousins whose financial disasters I had helped clean up over the years, and certainly not the father who was smiling proudly as though he had just delivered the joke of the evening. Meanwhile, I remained seated exactly where I was, staring at him across the table while a realization settled over me with unsettling clarity. Because humiliation hurts. But what hurts even more is recognizing that the people watching it happen have already decided it is acceptable. If you enjoy stories about family betrayal, quiet justice, and people who discover too late that actions have consequences, subscribe to Unspoken Truth, because we share stories like this every day. My name is Emily. I am 34 years old. I work as a financial consultant, and for most of my adult life I made the mistake of believing that helping family created loyalty, because every time someone close to me faced a financial crisis, I stepped in. When my cousin Daniel nearly lost his business after a disastrous expansion plan, I provided the loan that kept the doors open. When my Aunt Rosa accumulated medical debt she could not pay, I quietly covered a large portion of it. When my younger brother buried himself under credit card balances he was too embarrassed to discuss publicly, I helped him negotiate a path-out before collections became involved. And when my parents occasionally found themselves struggling despite claiming everything was under control, I always found discreet ways to help without damaging their pride. I never asked for public gratitude, I never demanded recognition, and I certainly never expected a standing ovation. But I also never expected to become the family scapegoat while the people benefiting from my generosity sat comfortably around a holiday table pretending I was the problem. The toast continued as though nothing unusual had happened. Conversations resumed, glasses clinked, music played softly in the background, and what struck me most was not my father's comment itself, but how quickly everyone adapted to it, because that adaptation revealed something important. It showed that the remark was not shocking to them. It fit into a narrative they had already accepted, a narrative where I was somehow difficult, selfish, distant, or ungrateful despite years of evidence pointing in the exact opposite direction. And as I sat there listening to relatives laugh, gossip, and discuss vacation plans, I began noticing details I normally would have ignored. Daniel laughing a little too loudly despite still owing me money, my brother avoiding eye contact whenever our gazes nearly met, my aunt enthusiastically agreeing with everything my father said while conveniently forgetting the financial support she had received from me less than 2 years earlier, and slowly a question formed in my mind, not why my father had humiliated me, but why so many people seemed invested in supporting the version of me that he had just presented. I stayed another 20 minutes before deciding to leave, not because I was emotional, although I certainly had every reason to be, but because remaining there would have required pretending that nothing had happened, and I was suddenly tired of pretending. So I stood, collected my coat, wished everyone a happy new year in a voice calm enough to disappoint anyone hoping for a scene, and walked out the front door without another word, leaving behind a room full of people who seemed far more uncomfortable with my quiet departure than they would have been with an argument. The messages began arriving before I reached home. First my sister asking why I was being dramatic, then my aunt explaining that my father had only been joking, then a cousin insisting that everyone knew he did not mean it seriously. And what fascinated me was that nobody addressed the insult itself. Nobody questioned why a father would publicly identify his daughter as useless during a family celebration. Instead, every conversation focused entirely on my reaction, as though the true offense had not been the humiliation but my refusal to smile through it. And over the next several days the pattern continued, text messages, calls, and carefully worded conversations all attempting to guide me toward the same conclusion, that I should simply move on. Normally I might have done exactly that, because ignoring family dysfunction had practically become a survival skill by that point. But 1 week later something happened that changed everything. Daniel called me unexpectedly. and from the moment I answered I could hear tension in his voice. He asked whether I was still upset about New Year's Eve, whether I planned to attend future family gatherings, whether I intended to keep my distance from everyone, and after several minutes of nervous conversation he made a mistake that instantly captured my attention, because he casually mentioned that he hoped I was not planning to review old paperwork connected to certain family loans, a statement so oddly specific that I nearly stopped speaking altogether. When I asked what paperwork he meant, he immediately began backtracking, claiming he was confused, claiming he had heard something and misunderstood it, claiming it was probably irrelevant, but people who know the truth often become clumsy when they try to hide it, and the harder he worked to retreat from comment, the more suspicious I became, because I spend my professional life identifying inconsistencies, analyzing risk, and finding weaknesses hidden beneath reassuring appearances. And everything about Daniel's reaction suggested he had accidentally stepped into territory he never intended to reveal. That same evening I opened a digital archive where I stored years of personal financial records, loan agreements, contracts, and correspondence connected to family assistance I had provided over the years. Initially, I only intended to satisfy my curiosity, but curiosity has a way of becoming something much larger when evidence begins appearing where it should not exist. And after several hours of reviewing files, I found a document connected to an old financial arrangement, a document carrying what appeared to be my signature authorizing actions I had absolutely no memory of approving. And the moment I saw it, I felt the first genuine wave of alarm since New Year's Eve. At first glance, the signature looked convincing, close enough that most people would accept it without hesitation. But I signed documents constantly, thousands of pages throughout my career, and familiarity creates instincts that are difficult to explain. Certain letter formations felt wrong, certain strokes lacked the natural rhythm of my handwriting, and although someone had clearly spent considerable effort creating the imitation, I became increasingly convinced that it was exactly that, an imitation. The signature itself was troubling, but the contents of the document were far worse, because the authorization connected my name to financial decisions I never would have approved. And once I started searching for related files, I discovered references to additional transactions, additional agreements, and additional financial structures involving people inside my family, structures that seemed connected in ways that made very little sense. And with every new document, the situation grew more unsettling, because this no longer looked like a clerical mistake, it looked like a pattern. By 3 in the morning, I was still sitting in front of my computer surrounded by records, spreadsheets, scanned contracts, and transaction histories, and the more information I uncovered, the less I believed that my father's New Year's Eve insult had been random, because if someone had spent years building financial arrangements around forged authorizations, hidden obligations, or carefully concealed debt, publicly discrediting the one person most capable of exposing it would be a remarkably useful strategy. And just as exhaustion finally began catching up with me, I opened another document, one far more recent than the first, containing another suspicious signature attached to an amount of money large enough to create serious consequences for everyone involved if something ever went wrong. And as I stared at the screen in the silence of my living room, I realized that the toast my father made on New Year's Eve might not have been the real story at all. It might simply have been the first crack in something much larger that had been hidden from me for years. I slept less than 3 hours that night, yet when morning arrived I did not feel tired. I felt focused, because there is a significant difference between discovering that someone has hurt your feelings and discovering that someone may have used your name, your reputation, and your financial credibility without your knowledge. Emotional wounds create uncertainty, but documents create trails, and trails can be followed, which is exactly what I intended to do. So while the rest of my family was likely moving on from the New Year's Eve incident, convinced that the worst thing that had happened was an awkward toast and a bruised ego, I was already examining something far more dangerous, something measured in signatures, authorizations, obligations, and numbers. The first thing I did was compare the suspicious signatures against dozens of legitimate examples from throughout my career: employment contracts, consulting agreements, banking documents, regulatory filings, and legal paperwork accumulated over years of professional activity. and the more comparisons I made, the more confident I became that the signatures were not mine. Because most people assume forgery succeeds or fails based on appearance alone, but professionals know that consistency matters more than resemblance. Tiny habits repeat themselves unconsciously across thousands of signatures, and although whoever created these documents had done impressive work, there were enough discrepancies to raise serious questions if the records were ever subjected to proper scrutiny. What concerned me even more was the access required to create them, because whoever had done this needed examples of my signature, access to personal information, familiarity with financial documentation, and enough confidence to assume I would never review the records closely. And when I considered who might satisfy those conditions, the list became alarmingly small. Because over the years I had shared documents with family members while helping them obtain loans, restructure debts, negotiate settlements, or navigate financial emergencies, never imagining that information provided in trust might someday become a tool against me. Over the next several days, I began requesting copies of records connected to the transactions I had uncovered, using professional contacts, formal procedures, and every legal avenue available to me. And while I waited for responses, I started reviewing old emails connected to family financial matters, initially expecting very little. But after several hours, patterns began emerging that I could not ignore. References to transfers that never appeared in original agreements, discussions about obligations that seemed to vanish without explanation, and inconsistencies that were individually small but collectively troubling. Because financial deception rarely depends on a single lie, it depends on many small lies supporting one another until they begin to resemble reality. At the same time, something else started happening, because apparently my questions were attracting attention, and before long a quiet campaign began spreading through the family. First subtle comments suggesting I had become overly sensitive after New Year's Eve, then suggestions that I was obsessed with money, then stories portraying me as bitter, isolated, and increasingly irrational. And what fascinated me was how coordinated the narrative felt, because the details varied slightly depending on who repeated them, but the core message remained identical. Emily was overreacting, Emily was unstable, Emily was looking for conflict where none existed. And the consistency of that message told me exactly what I needed to know. Someone was preparing defenses before accusations had even been made. The most revealing detail emerged through a cousin who called intending to smooth things over, because after enough conversation she casually mentioned that my father had been speaking with relatives individually, explaining his version of events and warning them not to take my concerns too seriously. And hearing that transformed suspicion into certainty. Because innocent people generally welcome transparency, they do not conduct preemptive reputation management campaigns, especially not before anyone knows what questions are being asked. A few days later, Daniel contacted me again, this time sounding far more anxious than before, and instead of speaking over the phone, he insisted we meet in person, choosing a small cafe on the opposite side of the city where the chances of running into family members were practically non-existent. And once we sat down, it became obvious that whatever he wanted to say had been weighing heavily on him, because he spent several minutes circling the subject before finally admitting that he had overheard conversations involving my father, my brother, and an accountant discussing financial problems far worse than anyone publicly acknowledged. According to Daniel, several family businesses had been struggling for years beneath the surface, debts had accumulated, investments had failed, and certain obligations were being maintained through increasingly complicated arrangements designed to delay consequences rather than solve problems. And while none of that was pleasant to hear, it was the next part that truly captured my attention, because he explained that some of those arrangements involved documentation connected to family members whose names carried credibility, individuals perceived as financially responsible and trustworthy by banks, creditors, and business partners. The moment he said that, a cold feeling settled in my chest, because I fit that description perfectly. Throughout my adult life I had built a reputation for professionalism, discipline, and financial competence, exactly the type of reputation someone might exploit if they needed legitimacy they could not generate on their own. And although Daniel could not provide direct proof, his explanation aligned disturbingly well with everything I had already uncovered. I left that meeting carrying more questions than answers, yet also more certainty than ever before that I was approaching something significant, and that certainty intensified when the first wave of requested records finally arrived, because several documents revealed connections between transactions that were supposedly unrelated, overlapping guarantees, interconnected obligations, and financial structures linking multiple relatives through arrangements that appeared intentionally difficult to trace, creating a network far more complicated than anything I had expected to find. Meanwhile, pressure from the family continued increasing. Relatives urged me to let the past go, accused me of damaging family unity, questioned my motives, and implied that professional success had made me arrogant. But the more aggressively they encouraged me to stop asking questions, the more convinced I became that those questions were leading somewhere important. Because people who have nothing to hide rarely become uncomfortable when facts are examined. Eventually, I decided it was time to consult a specialist, so I arranged a confidential meeting with an attorney experienced in financial fraud cases, bringing copies of the suspicious documents, transaction histories, correspondence, and notes I had gathered over the previous weeks, and from the moment he began reviewing the material, his reaction was far more serious than I expected. Because instead of dismissing the situation as a family dispute, he started asking highly specific questions about dates, authorizations, signatures, and financial relationships, questions that suggested he was seeing patterns I had not yet fully recognized. For nearly 2 hours he worked through the records, constructing timelines, identifying overlaps, and marking connections between transactions. And when he finally leaned back in his chair, there was a long silence before he spoke, the kind of silence that professionals use when deciding how much truth a client is prepared to hear. And then he explained that if the signatures were indeed forged, and if the financial relationships connected the way they appeared to, I might not be dealing with isolated misconduct at all. I might be looking at a much larger system where multiple people had participated, knowingly or unknowingly, in maintaining obligations through documentation that could collapse under serious examination. I left his office carrying a folder full of notes, recommendations, and possible legal strategies, but what weighed on me most was not the paperwork, it was the realization that I had probably uncovered only a fraction of the truth, because if the attorney was correct, then the New Year's Eve humiliation, the rumors, the forged signatures, the hidden debts, and the coordinated attempts to undermine my credibility were not separate problems, they were pieces of the same structure, a structure someone had spent years building and protecting. And just as I reached my car, my phone vibrated with a notification that another records request had been fulfilled, a document containing a list of individuals connected to a series of financial guarantees. And when I opened the file and looked at the first name on the page, the name at the very top was mine. Seeing my name at the top of that list changed everything, because until that moment I had still been trying to determine whether I was looking at a collection of bad decisions, desperate shortcuts, and financial irresponsibility. But the deeper I went, the harder it became to believe that explanation. And after spending weeks uncovering forged signatures, hidden obligations, coordinated rumors, and increasingly complicated financial arrangements, I was forced to accept a possibility I had resisted from the beginning, that certain members of my family had not merely concealed mistakes from me, they had actively used my identity, my reputation, and my professional credibility to support financial structures that might never have survived proper scrutiny. The following morning I received a phone call from an accountant who had worked with several members of my family for years, someone I knew by name but had never spoken to directly outside occasional professional interactions. And from the moment he introduced himself I could hear tension in his voice, the kind that develops when someone has spent too long carrying information they no longer feel comfortable holding alone. And after a brief conversation, he asked to meet in person as soon as possible, explaining that he had discovered records from previous years that needed to be reviewed immediately, records that might significantly alter my understanding of the situation, and the urgency in his tone was enough to convince me without further explanation. The meeting took place the next morning in a modest office above a commercial building that looked old enough to have witnessed decades of business disputes, tax filings, and financial negotiations, and for nearly 3 hours I sat across from him while he opened folders, produced archived correspondence, and walked me through records stretching back several years. And with each new document, the situation became more difficult to dismiss as simple family dysfunction, because what emerged was not a single act of fraud, but a long pattern of increasingly risky financial behavior, hidden loans, overlapping guarantees, and transactions designed to create the appearance of stability long after genuine stability had disappeared. According to the accountant, several family businesses had been operating under significant financial pressure for years, yet rather than confronting those problems directly, certain individuals had chosen to delay consequences through increasingly complex arrangements, refinancing obligations with new obligations, using one guarantee to support another, and creating layers of documentation that made the true level of risk difficult to recognize. And what made the situation particularly disturbing was how often my name appeared throughout those structures, sometimes attached to authorizations I never signed, sometimes referenced through documentation I had provided years earlier while helping relatives solve legitimate financial problems, and sometimes positioned in ways that implied involvement I had never knowingly accepted. As I listened, something unexpected happened, because instead of feeling overwhelmed by anger, I felt clarity, the kind of clarity that arrives when scattered pieces finally begin forming a coherent picture. And for the first time since New Year's Eve I understood why my father had chosen that moment to humiliate me publicly, why rumors had spread through the family so quickly afterward, and why so many people seemed desperate for me to stop asking questions. Because once the truth emerged, the person they needed most was no longer the daughter they could shame into silence, but the professional capable of exposing everything they were trying to protect. The accountant eventually handed over copies of records he believed were relevant, and after consulting with my attorney I made a decision that changed the direction of the entire situation, because rather than confronting relatives individually or engaging in endless family arguments, I submitted the documentation through proper legal and regulatory channels, allowing independent professionals to examine the evidence without emotional influence. And once that process began, the matter stopped being a family disagreement and became something much more difficult to control. The first consequences arrived surprisingly fast, because financial institutions reviewing the documentation began asking questions that could not easily be answered. Certain credit facilities were frozen pending investigation, transactions were re-examined, compliance departments became involved, and several organizations requested supporting documentation for obligations that had previously escaped meaningful scrutiny. And with every review additional inconsistencies surfaced, some small, some significant, but all pointing toward the same conclusion, that the image of financial stability presented to the outside world was far less reliable than many people had claimed. At the same time, I made another decision that proved just as important. I stopped acting as the family's financial safety net entirely. I declined new requests for assistance, ended informal lending arrangements, and refused to involve myself in crises created by people who had spent years taking my support for granted. And the reaction was immediate, because many of the same relatives who had laughed during the New Year's Eve toast suddenly discovered how much they depended on resources they barely acknowledged existed. Some attempted guilt, some appealed to family loyalty, some insisted that I was abandoning them during difficult times. But for the first time in my adult life I recognized those arguments for what they were, efforts to restore a system that benefited everyone except the person carrying its weight. My father struggled more than anyone with the changing reality, not necessarily because he faced the most severe financial consequences, but because he lost something he had always assumed was permanent: control over the family narrative. For decades he had occupied the position of unquestioned authority, the person whose explanations were accepted automatically, whose version of events became the official version, and whose confidence often discouraged further inquiry. But evidence has a way of undermining authority when authority depends on selective truth. And as documentation accumulated, as investigations progressed, and as more people began seeing facts rather than stories, that influence started eroding. One moment remains particularly vivid in my memory, because several months later a much smaller family gathering took place, one attended only by relatives who still maintained contact with one another after everything that had happened. and during a conversation my father attempted to explain the situation in a way that minimized responsibility and shifted blame elsewhere, something that would have worked effortlessly in the past. Yet this time nobody rushed to support him, nobody argued on his behalf, and nobody repeated his explanation afterward. Instead there was silence, and that silence carried more significance than any confrontation could have, because it revealed that unquestioned belief had finally been replaced by doubt. As investigations continued, hidden debts became visible, financial weaknesses that had been concealed for years were exposed, several business arrangements required restructuring, and multiple relatives were forced to confront obligations they had hoped would remain buried indefinitely. And while not everyone faced legal consequences, nearly everyone faced reality, which in many ways proved far more uncomfortable, because reality demanded accountability where excuses once sufficed. For me, however, the most meaningful transformation occurred away from courtrooms, audits, and financial reviews, because I finally stopped measuring my value through usefulness. I stopped assuming that love required endless sacrifice, and I stopped believing that protecting family meant protecting every bad decision made by family members. And that shift changed my life more profoundly than any legal victory ever could, because it allowed me to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation. Almost a year after the New Year's Eve toast, I attended another family gathering, a quieter event attended by fewer people and carrying none of the confidence that had once defined those celebrations. And as I walked through the room, I noticed something remarkable. Nobody asked me for money. Nobody attempted to manipulate me emotionally. Nobody treated my boundaries as temporary inconveniences. And for the first time I could remember, I was not viewed primarily as a resource. Near the end of the evening, my father and I found ourselves standing near the front door while everyone else prepared to leave, and for a moment it seemed as though he wanted to say something significant, perhaps an explanation, perhaps an apology, perhaps an attempt to rewrite the story one final time, but ultimately very little was said, and strangely enough that felt appropriate, because some stories do not end with dramatic confessions or perfect reconciliation. They end when the truth no longer requires defense, when consequences arrive without revenge needing to be pursued, and when the person publicly labeled useless discovers that she was the quiet foundation supporting far more than anyone ever cared to admit, including the man who pointed at her on New Year's Eve and believed she would never realize her own worth until it was far too late.